You commanded my presence, Your Grace.
Final Fantasy XVI producer Naoki Yoshida has made no secret about drawing inspiration from Game of Thrones for the latest epic in the long-running series. But the influence of A Song of Ice and Fire goes way beyond its British medieval roots. And at points, the similarities are as heavy-handed as Ramsay Bolton with Theon's special area. So let's take a look at 49 moments in Final Fantasy XVI that feel less like they took inspiration from Game of Thrones and more like George R.R. Martin walked directly into the minds of the team at Square Enix. Full warning, we are going to be covering the entirety of Final Fantasy XVI, right up to the finale, so there will be extremely big spoilers. There will, naturally, be a fair few for Game of Thrones too. Here's your chance to back out. Right, let's start big and obvious. Clive, the protagonist of Final Fantasy XVI, is basically Jon Snow, and here's why. Clive, despite growing up in a highborn family, is considered a black sheep. Clive has a pet dog with white hair, more on that later. Clive has a close relationship with his uncle. Clive has a bad relationship with his mum, just as Jon does with his motherly figure. After the downfall of his family, Clive is branded as a bearer, a second-class citizen forced into servitude. He serves as part of an Imperial squad of branded assassins called the Bastards, which is not wholly unlike serving in the Night's Watch. Also, you know, he gets called a bastard a lot.
You're Ned Stark's bastard, aren't you?
Both fully dress in black, and they carry a big f***-off sword to boot. Speaking of black, both Jon and Clive rock the dark locks, while their siblings tend not to. Clive is eventually revealed to be the dominant of fire, who can summon the fire demon Ifrit. And Jon is revealed as a Targaryen, the only existing Westeros lineage capable of wielding fire demons of their own. And lastly, well, they just look the same. Now let's dive into the Rossfield family, and there's more than a parallel or two to the Starks. Elwyn is Clive's father, the noble leader of our starring house and ruler of Rosaria who is respected by all. Does it remind you of anyone? Elwyn tragically dies at the start of our story, leading to the splintering of his family. Remind you of anyone? Elwyn loves his flawed and ostracized son, even though his wife despises him. Does this remind you of anyone?
We'll talk about him, Mother.
Next down the line is Clive's little brother and the dominant of the Phoenix, Joshua, aka Brandon Stark. Joshua is obsessively protected by his mother. Joshua is thought to be dead earlier in the story. After his death is revealed to be a fake-out, Joshua goes on his own mysterious adventure with a female companion. A Hodor equivalent isn't around for this part of the story, but you can bet your ass he's gonna pop up later in this list.
Hodor.
Joshua has become an even more powerful being during his absence, stopping slightly short of calling himself the Three-Eyed Phoenix. Joshua is in constant pain, just like poor Bran. Joshua spends a good chunk of his journey going on about his brother, and there are several moments where the two almost connect before they finally reunite. And when they are reunited, Joshua is shockingly quick to dismiss his loyal companion, just like how Bran quickly and callously discarded Mira when he returned to Winterfell.
You don't need me anymore.
No, I don't.
And lastly, Bran has a connection with the embodiment of the world's impending doom, the Night King, constantly seeking out knowledge of his existence. Joshua is on a mission to find out everything about Valisthea's equivalent. More on him later.
I know you're there, Ultima.
Thought we were done with the Rossfields? Think again. Clive and Joshua's mother Annabella is also along for the ride. She's less like one specific character and instead shares traits with Catelyn Stark, Lysa Arryn and Cersei Lannister. Annabella rejects her child for not being pure blood, just like Catelyn Stark.
Came to say goodbye to Bran.
You've said it.
Her new son Olivier clings to her constantly and is a proxy for her power and is only one breastfeed away from being Robin Arryn.
I'm hungry. Hush, I'm done.
Annabella betrays her royal husband for the sole goal of getting her child into a seat of power, just like a certain Lannister we all remember. Like Cersei, she also has 3 children who, she believes, at some point all died before her.
You will not take me!
Clive's companion and love interest Jill Warwick is also guilty of an inspiration or two, with her background reminding us of the story of Theon Greyjoy. Jill was taken as a child as a political prisoner, becoming a ward to the Rossfields. Theon suffered the exact same fate, being forced into wardship with the Starks at Winterfell.
You act as if I volunteered to go.
Despite the situation though, Clive and Joshua consider her family, just like the Starks did with Theon, you know, before that mucky betrayal. And lastly, Jill has a horrible past with the Iron Kingdom and is looking to get closure. Yet, the isolated Iron Kingdom, home to the Ironblood. Absolutely nothing like the Ironborn who live on the Iron Islands that also consider themselves an independent kingdom.
You're Ironborn.
They're even both bloody islands located just off the west coast of the map. It's definitely not subtle with this one. Speaking of not subtle, this man is named Goats, aka Hodor. He's a friendly but slow giant who spends time with our heroes and even carries one of them on his back at one point. Another companion is Clive's loyal pet dog called Torgal, the white pup we mentioned earlier. Later on he becomes huge and eventually you find out he's actually a wolf from the north, who was found by Clive's father Elwyn on the road one day by chance. That is just basically straight up the backstory for Ghost. That's unbelievable.
Run to the litter. That one's yours, Snow.
Also, just like Ghost, he's bloody useful in battle too. Gav is Clive's Geordie mate, who seems to be a unique character for the majority of the game. That is until he and Clive enter the deserted, monster-filled territory of Ash and stumble upon a solitary woman called Edda, who he immediately takes a shine to. Just like her Game of Thrones counterpart Gilly, Edda happens to be pregnant and will no doubt name her son Little Gav. Because of course Clive's best friend had to just have a little bit of Sam Tarly in him. It's not just the characters that bear a passing resemblance to the world of Ice and Fire though, with the actual land of Valisthea feeling a little more than familiar. Valisthea is made up of two large landmasses, Storm and Ash. Storm, to the west, is made up of multiple nations that are in constant conflict. Ash, to the east, has its own kingdoms, one of which sails across the sea to interfere with the conflict in Storm. This is just parallels to Westeros and Essos again. There's also literally a location called the Twins. It's located at the closest crossing point between the continents of Storm and Ash, much like how the Twins in Game of Thrones is the crossing point over the Green Fork. And the body of sea between the two continents? It's called the Narrow, the same. The Citadel in Oriflamme, home to the Holy Emperor of Sanbreque, looks very much like the Red Keep. And lastly, the Crystalline Dominion takes the replication of King's Landing to the next level, especially when the city comes under siege by a giant dragon. Now brace yourself because this bit is almost beat for beat replicating scenes from the final season of Game of Thrones. There's this shot, and there's this one. Oh, and don't forget this one. Who's controlling the dragon though? That'll be Dion Lesage, the Targaryen-looking prince who's also a dominant of Bahamut. Dion turns on his people in a fit of rage and manipulation after the throne of his birthright is taken away from him. Yep, very familiar. Dion is constantly a morally grey character, who Joshua regularly believes can be an ally against the true threat of Valisthea. All feels very Daenerys, doesn't it? Dion also shares some DNA with Renly Baratheon. Just like Renly, Dion wages war with his private army after he's rejected for the crown in favour of a little kid.
I am the king!
He also happens to have his chief commander as his lover, just like Renly and Solaris. And lastly, Dion's family has the most powerful military in all of Storm, much like the Lannisters. And just like the Lannisters, Dion always pays his debts. How do we know that? Well, he just bloody says it, doesn't he?
And I always pay my debts.
But surely that's enough, right? No, there's more. Kupka, a man known for his fists and the damage he can inflict, has them cut off. Jaime Lannister, Game of Thrones' famous Kingslayer, was also known for his deadly right hand before he lost it. Am I stretching with this one? Well, no, because just like when Jaime loses his hand, Kupka gets a metal replacement. A major plot point in Final Fantasy XVI is the treatment of bearers, people who can naturally perform magic. They're treated as slaves by most nations, and Clive aims to make life better for them all. He is essentially a breaker of chains.
But a chain can always be broken, as long as one has the will to break it.
And yes, he is actually talking about breaking the chain here too, referring to it as a system that needs to be torn down, much like a certain wheel that needed to be broken.
I'm going to break the wheel.
Remember the mention of the Night King earlier? Well, Final Fantasy XVI's big bad is Ultima, a godlike being looking to destroy all human will, who's happily turning every living creature in his path into an icy looking, mindless zombie army called White Walkers. Called the Akashic. And finally, these missions are called A Song of Hope and Fire and Ice, the ultimate example of changing up the homework a bit so it doesn't look like you copied.
What's this?
A song of ice and fire.
And that's everything we spotted, but honestly, there's likely dozens more. What did you notice? And for everything else Final Fantasy XVI, and I guess Game of Thrones too, stick with IGN.